The Oculus Imperatoris, also known as the Eyes of the Emperor, might be one of the most misunderstood factions in the Imperium, if not in all of Warhammer 40k. A faction that is constantly misrepresented, and has more depth and presence in the setting than most realize. Sure, some of these demigods disappear into the shadows and become little more than Imperial spies, but in reality, the Eyes of the Emperor at large become so much more. They're assassins, infiltrators, secret rulers of entire planets, and sometimes even inquisitors. But if that's not enough to grab your attention, then I have to tell you that somewhere out in the galaxy is an unofficial shield host of heavily augmented Ex-Custodes fighting its own secret war. The Eyes of the Emperor aren't just another branch of the Imperium. They aren't just superhuman spies. They are something far more dangerous, and something that may have been driving countless stories on a massive scale within Warhammer 40k for a very long time. But first, a quick and welcome word from the sponsor of today's video. One custodian is worth 100 warriors. Unbreakable, unyielding, unmatched. The Adeptus Custodes have arrived in Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. This is Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the ultimate mobile turn-based tactical strategy game in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Build your squad from 80 plus champions across 18 factions, and take on PvE campaigns, PvP battles, guild raids and more, all in lightning-fast tactical skirmishes. And the Custodes? These are frontline melee tanks, the personal guards of the Emperor himself, built to annihilate anything in their path. They absorb insane amounts of damage and return the favor tenfold. I have loved playing. The Tacticus devs have done a great job bringing the unmatched Custodes power trip to the game. They're launching with back-to-back events, Watchers of the Throne, the Trajan Valoris Legendary event, and the Asoth Kumadra release, so now's the time to jump in. I love that Tacticus keeps evolving. New champions, new game modes, constant updates. Tacticus has earned its 4.5 star rating on the App Store. Download Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus now using my link in the description or scan the QR code. Whether you're new or a Warhammer veteran, the game is dripping with content for you to enjoy. Use code HelloJuly to get 50 Blackstone and 20 energy instantly. Come and play Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus today. To understand why and how the roles of the Eyes of the Emperor are so varied, there are a few custodian skills we need to touch upon first. Skills that are often forgotten under the insurmountable weight of constantly being compared to the Space Marines. The Adeptus Custodes aren't just golden demigods standing guard at the Emperor's side. Thanks to the 8th edition Custodes Codex, we know these warriors are trained to be masters of just about everything. Take assassination for example. Properly equipped, a custodian can match any operative from the Officio Assassinorum, but their skills extend far beyond that of just killing. The Custodes are also trained to be political heavyweights. We know from the same codex that they're trained in diplomacy and statecraft. They're able to rule with the same finesse as any Ultramarine Tetrarch. Similarly, each of the 10,000 can command a battlefield like a top-tier Imperial Guard general if that is what is needed of them. So thorough is the education of the Custodes because once upon a time, the Emperor needed peers, intellectual equals, not just bodyguards, but companions he could actually converse with. We see much of this in the Master of Mankind novel with Ra Endymion, a custodian tribune who the Emperor repeatedly confides in throughout the book. The Golden Legion has always operated outside of the Imperium's chain of command too. Neither the High Lords of Terra nor the Inquisition can bring them to heel through authority alone. And to top it off, they've got unfiltered access to the Imperium's deepest secrets. Even their minds are fortified. While they're not psychers or blanks, their 8th edition codex tells us that they're protected from the warp in ways we can't or won't be able to fully understand. This has been reflected in the tabletop games in various editions, where lone custodian commanders would be able to manifest various Deny the Witch tests to shut down enemy psychers without raising a sword or firing a bolt round. The 10,000 aren't just warriors, they're perfection made manifest. Their gene-crafted organs outperform even the most advanced cybernetics, as detailed in the 10th edition codex. That's how refined they are. Their creation is so immense that no bionic that exists within the Imperium could replace a part of custodian physiology without making that warrior less effective. And the custodian mindset too mirrors this innate necessitation of perfection. Thanks to a number of books, including Regent Shadow 2020, we know that their core philosophy is simple. If it were not possible to do a thing perfectly, then it should not be done at all. Perfection isn't a goal or an aspiration for the Custodes, like it has been for the Emperor's Children and the Iron Hands. It's the standard, the baseline. Anything less simply isn't worthy of their undertaking or acknowledgement. Now, we must move on to the first major misconception of the Eyes of the Emperor. Though I say misconception, I believe it's more of a collective gross overstatement by the community, to be exact. There's this widespread belief that becoming an Eye of the Emperor is just what happens when a custodian gets old and starts to slow down. And yes, some Eyes are older custodians who've served for centuries or millennia and have finally begun to feel the weight of time upon their shoulders. But there's a few hints in the lore to tell us they're not the majority. A big factor here is augmentation. The 10th edition Custodes Codex reminds us that a custodian's organs are superior to any cybernetic implant. Nothing, no augmetic or piece of tech can match their handcrafted biological perfection. When those organs are damaged beyond natural recovery, or when injury forces even minor augmetic replacements, that perfection is compromised. This is why there are literally no Custodes models for the tabletop game that have any true bionics. At this moment in time, there's only 2 official depictions of an Eye of the Emperor. One found in the 8th edition Adeptus Custodes Codex, and the other in the 10th. The one in the 8th doesn't show a withered old warrior. Instead, it shows a figure almost entirely rebuilt with cybernetics. That's no accident. The same codex notes that custodians tire not from age, but from injury, lost limbs, artificial eyes, augmetic organs. These imperfections don't kill them, but they erode the physical perfection that defines them. For many, it's this mechanical intrusion, not the passing of centuries, that marks the beginning of their path as an Eye. Though I will freely admit the 10th edition depiction doesn't show an Eye covered in cybernetics, but is instead a custodian so covered in robes that one can't identify much beyond the eyes. For a custodian, their philosophy of perfection, of serving the Emperor with an ideal body and an ideal mind, is a really big deal. If their body or mind no longer reflects that ideal, they don't just push through it, they step aside. And that's where the Eyes come in. For some, becoming an Eye is a way to continue serving in a manner befitting their current form. We know from the 8th edition Codex that when a custodian deems himself unfit for frontline service, he returns his wargear to the Hall of Armaments, and disappears into the galaxy in hooded black robes. It's a quiet, almost monastic rite of passage. However, this is another community-wide misconception that's only partially true. As per the 10th edition Codex, the Eyes may in fact take pieces of custodian equipment into their new role with the Captain General's blessing. I'm of the mind that there are 2 schools of thought for what equipment they can take, but I'll cover that later in this video. In any event, this change matters. It reinforces that these warriors aren't retiring. They're repurposing, still powerful, still vigilant, just not bound to the throne or any shield host. Thanks to Regent Shadow again, we know from SHIELD Captain Valerian that those who become Eyes haven't exactly faded into irrelevance. In fact, he describes them as individuals who've barely lost any of their might, still capable of feats far beyond that of most beings in the galaxy, Imperial or otherwise. So it's not about weakness, it's about change, a shift in how they serve the Emperor. The reason for stepping into this role varies. As mentioned, some are veterans of countless campaigns whose mental faculties have begun to erode. The 10th edition Codex refers to these rare cases as others, implying they're a minority. But the truth is, most Eyes still likely possess sharp minds and devastating skill. The shift is philosophical, driven by the smallest deviation from the impossible standards they hold themselves to. Whether due to battle damage, physical strain, or yes, even the encroachment of age, something changes. And that change is enough. But even among the Custodes, not everyone accepts the mantle of the Eye. For those who feel they've failed in some way, morally, spiritually, or dishonored themselves in some capacity, some custodians see themselves as unworthy to become an Eye. In those cases, they choose a far darker path, intentional dreadnought internment. The 8th edition Codex gives us insight into this. Unlike the Astartes, the Custodes are less likely to see dreadnoughts not as honoured second lives, but as prisons of pain. This is one truly perilous downside to having such an all-encompassing education. Every single custodian knows that dreadnought interment is a living, paralysing hell. Even the Contemptor Dreadnought, a relic revered by the Space Marine chapters that are lucky enough to possess 1 or 2 in the 41st millennium, is the least valued by the 10,000. They instead favour their Telamon, Galatas and Achilles patterns. But make no mistake, they understand that every dreadnought existence is a tomb of suffering. This tells us a lot about how the Custodes view those amongst their number who become Eyes. It's something held honourably aloft, a role those who've deemed themselves dishonourable will intentionally avoid in favour of perpetual torture, as they themselves have not upheld the custodian ideal and philosophy of perfection. SHIELD Captain Valerian even notes that those who become an Eye of the Emperor embody the custodian philosophy better than anyone or anything by acknowledging their own imperfection. As I mentioned before, It's easy to think the eyes of the Emperor just disappear into the shadows and spend the rest of their days watching, waiting, reporting. But that's actually another community misconception that really undersells what they actually do. Once a custodian becomes an eye, their work doesn't stop or slow down. In fact, for plenty, it becomes far more active than when they were a part of the Golden Legion. Some stay on Terra and dive into its web of secrets. Others vanish into the stars to act on their own judgment. They're not merely sentinels anymore, they're spies, leaders, detectives, generals, and sometimes rulers of entire worlds. The Shadow Agents of Terra. One of the most fascinating things about the Eyes of the Emperor is they're not just assigned a mission and sent on their way. They actually get to choose how they serve as an eye. And that's not speculation either. We know from Regent Shadow 2020 that when a custodian becomes an eye, they're given the freedom to decide how best to continue serving. It could mean vanishing into the void, roaming the stars alone like a golden ghost. Or it could mean staying right at the heart of the Imperium, on Terra itself. Take Oculus Imperatoris Kaluin, for example. He's one of the very few named eyes we've got in the lore, and the novel tells us that he chose to remain on Terra as part of the Custodes' vast hidden spy network. Considering Terra's status not just as head of the Imperium, but as one of the most overpopulated and volatile hive worlds in existence, it makes a lot of sense that multiple eyes would stay close. And Kaluin himself? He's ancient. So old that Shield Captain Valerian barely understands the form of High Gothic he speaks, ostensibly a language from another time. He lives in a tiny room, surrounded by maps and data, like some kind of divine conspiracy theorist. It's a small glimpse into how an eye's life can look. They're shaped by their own purpose, their chosen purpose, and that freedom, that personal agency is what makes Eyes of the Emperor so compelling. Spies and Deceivers. This is what most people think the Eyes of the Emperor do exclusively. Slip through the shadows, watch from afar, and maybe whisper a warning if something's about to go wrong. And whilst that's part of it, it's only the beginning, but it's very cool nonetheless. Some eyes go completely solo, slipping through the shadows like walking omens, showing up exactly where they need it and leaving just as quietly. Others take a more social route, building entire networks of informants and agents. They don't just rely on oaths or loyalty either. Sometimes fear and raw presence do a better job. The 8th edition codex tells us some eyes use intimidation when honor falls short. But the 10th edition codex takes it a step further, describing how they overawe people into compliance. And I genuinely find that hilarious. The Eyes of the Emperor don't just ask you to cooperate, they'll mog you into doing it. They show up, say very little, and suddenly your soul knows it's time to fall in line. If an Eye of the Emperor sees something threatening Terra or the Emperor, the 8th edition codex says they use secret channels to alert the Captain General. And that sounds clean in theory, but we know from Regent Shadow that this communication isn't always reliable. Messages can be delayed, lost, or flat out ignored, which means, more often than not, the Eye just has to deal with the threat themselves. No backup, no ceremony. Just a lone golden juggernaut deciding the fate of entire populations with nothing but their own terrifying intuition. One of the cool and lesser-known aspects of Eyes that take up this role is how they can reattach to Adeptus Custodes strike forces in combat. Take note of Oculus Imperatoris Themis, an Eye of the Emperor who has been a part of the Gilded Talon Shield Company for combat missions. Whilst the 8th Ed Codex doesn't say it openly, I believe that having an eye attached to a shield company can only reasonably be assumed to show that said eye has provided said company with its mission objective and is present to help see it through. Bureaucratic Demi-Gods. Here's something that you probably didn't know. Some Eyes of the Emperor end up working deep inside the Administratum. Yep, some of these towering golden warriors take off the warplate and step straight into the bureaucratic nightmare that runs the Imperium. And in a fun, roundabout way, they're really well suited for it. Remember, the Custodes are masters of all things. Within the confines of the Imperium, their intellect is only really surpassed by Primarchs. The 10th edition Custodes Codex tells us that some eyes take up roles as high adepts, diving headfirst into mountains of data and records, combing through endless streams of logistics to spot the tiniest signs of treachery. It is a kind of warfare, just one fought with information instead of weapons. During their time in the Administratum, they'll in all probability command entire teams, dozens or even hundreds of minor adepts, who'll help process and track the absurd scale of information pouring through the Imperium every second. It's not glamorous in the slightest, but it's crucial. After all, a missed supply run or a false report can spiral into a planetary catastrophe if left unchecked. What makes this role so interesting is how it reflects the broader strengths of the Custodes. They're not just built to fight and kill, they're built to understand. It's similar to how Rabute Gilliman raised the Ultramarines, valuing governance as much as battle acumen. In the novel No Fear, we see that Gilliman envisioned a future where his sons would rule and manage humanity benevolently, not just wage war forever. These retired Custodes fight corruption and incompetence from the inside out, putting their unmatched intellect into overdrive. And in a system as bloated and unstable as the Imperium, sometimes the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. Doomslayers, Warlords, Generals. Not every eye of the Emperor fades into shadow or slips into the bureaucratic grind. Some of them go full Doomslayer. From what we can gather in the 10th edition Codex, there's a strong implication that some eyes choose a far more direct approach, seeking out war zones or hostile regions they can handle alone and just go to work. Just one demi-god of war ripping and tearing until the problem is solved. It's not spelled out beat for beat, but it's pretty clear that some eyes take the fight to the enemy in the most brutal and straightforward way possible. But not all of them operate as lone wolves. The same codex suggests that eyes can step into the role of generals, commanders who take to the field alongside Imperial forces, be it some militia or the Imperial Guard. The idea of an eye inspiring battered guardsmen to rally and counterattack is entirely in line with how these warriors think. They're commanding presences, capable of turning panic into fury and retreat into defiance. This mix of roles, brutal executioner or rallying leader, really shows how flexible the eyes are in their methods. They're not locked into any one way of fighting or serving. Once they're outside the structure of the 10,000, they choose what they believe is most needed. Sometimes that's quiet observation. Other times it's turning a battlefield into a butcher's yard, or stepping up to lead when no one else can. That freedom to decide how to wage war on their own terms is hands down one of my favorite things about this underrepresented faction. Planetary rulers in Nihilus. One of the wildest bits of lore around the eyes of the Emperor in the new Codex comes from the aftermath of the Great Rift, when the galaxy tore in half and communication with huge swathes of the Imperium was lost. A lot of custodians operating as eyes got stranded on the wrong side, in Imperium Nihilus, and, as you might have guessed, they haven't been idle. We know that some of these stranded eyes witnessed entire worlds slipping into corruption, planetary governors going rogue, systems falling into chaos, all of it playing out with no one from Terra able to respond. So what did the eyes do? They took over. More than one world in Imperium Nihilus is being entirely run by an eye of the Emperor. It's very ultramarine coded, but the truth is, the eyes will often find themselves in situations where they are just outright the most qualified person to do a job, and this is no different. These are beings trained not just for combat, but for diplomacy, governance, philosophy. So when everything else falls apart, they can step in and hold the line, not just on the battlefield, but across an entire planetary system. Becoming an Inquisitor. By now, it should be pretty clear that the eyes of the Emperor are so much more than silent watchers or shadowy informants. Thanks to the 10th Ed Codex, we know they're not just spies or spy masters. They can become almost anything the Imperium needs them to be. Some become assassins, moving through the galaxy, eliminating threats before they can spread. Others take a more subtle approach, working as saboteurs, raiders, or architects of misinformation campaigns. The Codex even mentions that some eyes have formed and led what can only be described as private military forces, hiring mercenaries, working through intermediaries, and running black ops outfits that answer only to them. And yes, in some cases, eyes have spent time masquerading as cult leaders, guiding religious armies like zealot demagogues in the Emperor's name. But my personal favorite, the eyes who become Inquisitors. It's said in the 10th Ed Codex that eyes have taken on this role, and it's perfect. Who's going to question it? They already answer only to the Captain General, the Emperor, and possibly Rabute Gilliman himself, the three most powerful men in the Imperium. An eye posing as an Inquisitor can pull rank on practically anyone. And better still, most never even reveal themselves. Many operate entirely through intermediaries, voxes, or shell agents, so their true identity is never uncovered by their enemies or allies. But some, in more intimate circumstances, will reveal the truth to a trusted retinue, so their agents know they serve not just any master, but a custodian, an emissary of the God Emperor himself. Which brings me to my favourite little theory. If you've been playing Warhammer 40,000 Darktide, you probably know about Interrogator Rannick, this no-nonsense, sharp-tongued officer who looks like Gary Oldman in The Fifth Element. He works directly under Inquisitor Grendel, a figure we know practically nothing about. The game goes out of its way to make Grendel mysterious. No one knows what he looks like, no one knows where he came from, and even his closest operatives only get vague instructions filtered through layers of command. Now here's the fun bit. Grendel doesn't operate like a typical Inquisitor. He's got a whole army on standby. His commandeered ship is full of rogue traders, interrogators, and the Mobian 53rd, a full guard regiment under Commissar Duquesne. That's not a retinue, it's a war machine. He's also got agents like the spy Swagger working under him, folks who definitely don't fall into the honourable category. It's a weird ragtag force, and Grendel holds it all together wordlessly from the shadows. We get even more in the Darktide Miniatures Game Rulebook 2024, where it says Grendel tasked an interrogator, one we never see in the video game, with investigating the Cold Iron Stack while he would personally oversee the rooting out of corruption throughout the entire Hive City. That doesn't sound like the job of a guy sitting in a command chair. That sounds like someone who's boots on the ground, someone capable of operating alone, eliminating high-value threats in person, someone like an Eye of the Emperor. So here's my theory. Grendel is an Eye. He's operating under a false name. Or maybe Grendel is his real name. After all, Custodes take their spoken name from ancient human myth. Grendel being a respelling of Grendel from the story of Beowulf fits perfectly. He's answering to no one but the Captain General and running a shadow war across Hive Tertium with a scale and subtlety that fits everything we know about what the Eyes can do. He stays hidden because his presence alone would upend the balance of command. And while the game's rejects are off handling smaller missions, Grendel is down there in the depths, probably going full Doomslayer on whatever nightmare is brewing. It fits too well. And if it turns out to be true, it would be one of the coolest lore drops in recent memory. But hey,
that's just a theory. A game theory.
Wargear of the Eyes. So as I said before, the most recent Custodes Codex tells us that custodians may retain some of their equipment when they become Eyes of the Emperor. That tiny little detail opens up a really fascinating area of discussion. What do these former golden demigods actually carry with them when they step out into their new role? When it comes to the armaments and equipment of the Eyes of the Emperor, for me, there are two schools of thought, and I think both have merit. The first school of thought is a bit more flexible. I would posit that when a custodian submits their weapons and war gear to the Hall of Armaments, part of the ritual when they leave behind their formal duties, they're not just giving everything up permanently. Instead, they might be allowed to submit a request for new, tailored war gear to the new role. This makes a lot of sense to me. If you're about to spend the next 100, 200, 300 years running a covert network of informants on Terra, maybe you don't need a full set of Auramite plate and a Guardian spear. But if you're headed into a chaos-infested Hive City to single-handedly dismantle a cult dedicated to Nurgle, like perhaps a certain Inquisitor Grendel, then yeah, you might need some actual combat kit. If you're going full Doomslayer on a planetary scale, it's completely reasonable to think that a custodian could requisition some of their old gear or even something new, better suited to the mission. And to back that up, I'd argue that if a custodian is planning to operate in a very specific way, it stands to reason that they'd be granted equipment to match that intent. As an example, I want to talk about kinetic destroyers. For those of you unfamiliar, the kinetic destroyers are ornate, heavy archaeotech revolvers, wielded by the Venatari Custodes. These things are gorgeous, and more importantly, they hit like a bus. We know from the Black Book Liber Imperium that Custodes Archaeotech pistols are only given to shield captains, tribunes, and custodians who've excelled during the Blood Games. The intense series of trials that test every part of a custodian's capability, and those who succeed sometimes go on to become Venatari. The reason I bring this up is because the kinetic destroyer is one of the few custodian weapons that could realistically be concealed. It's small by Custodes standards, powerful, and has a serious punch, easily outclassing a bolt shell. If you've got a custodian running covert ops, trying to keep a low profile, this is exactly the kind of thing you'd imagine them carrying. So in that light, the first school of thought holds up well. Specialized missions might allow for specialized gear. Now, let's move on to the second school of thought. This one is a bit simpler, and I'll admit, it's a bit more likely. Custodes wargear is handcrafted to the individual. We're not talking about standardized kits, so under this view, any weapons or armor an eye takes with them after leaving the ranks would just be drawn from stuff they've already used. Not necessarily everything they once wore or wielded, but certainly some of it. It's consistent with the idea of a lifelong commitment to their gear. They don't swap out weapons like Astartes might for the sake of variety. Custodes build a deep familiarity with their tools, because they're lumped with the exact same tools for centuries, and that bond wouldn't just vanish once they step into a new role. It's a little sad in a way, because it limits the idea of eyes walking out with new custom loadouts. But it's clean, it fits, and again, Custodes don't need flashy relics to be deadly. A power sword in their hands is more than enough to destroy basically anything that a Guardian Spear could bring low. Now, regardless of which of these schools of thought you lean toward, I think it's pretty safe to assume that there are limits. The Custodes, like the Astartes, have access to vaults full of relics, some of which are ancient, irreplaceable, and incredibly powerful. I highly doubt any of those items are ever assigned to the eyes. Take the Presidius, for example. When it was first mentioned in Psychic Awakening, War of the Spider, it was described as an armor plate with integrated bubble deflector shield generators, basically a miniaturized version of the flare shields you'd see on super heavy Space Marine tanks. Only wearable. Then in 10th edition, they expanded its rules and effects in-game to act more or less like an invisibility cloak. It makes the user impossible to target until they're already in killing range. It would be the most brilliant type of weapon to give to any Eye of the Emperor. But no, the Presidius isn't going with any eye into the field. It's sealed in the war vaults of the Aquilan shield host, where it will remain. The same goes for Adrathic weapons. I won't go into a deep dive here, but if you're unfamiliar, Adrathic weaponry is an ancient form of Terran energy weapon, used almost exclusively by the Custodes and Sisters of Silence. It's described as a weapon that unravels matter at a molecular level, melting enemies into nothingness. They're extremely unstable and are ostensibly just greater disintegration weapons. Their reclamation was prioritized by the Emperor himself during the Unification Wars, and they've remained locked down ever since. It's hard to imagine an eye casually walking off with one, even if it were part of their original panoply of war. But aside from those truly legendary pieces, I don't see why most standard Custodes gear would be off limits. The Codex doesn't go into deep detail about how much an eye can take, but the Custodes have always been about functionality and enabling perfect functionality. If a Custodian has a good reason to bring their full warplate or primary weapon into the field, I don't think the Captain General's going to stop them. And while we're at it, outside of Astartes' armor, relic wargear, and vehicles, there's not much a Custodian couldn't use or have if they wanted to. Heroes of the Oculus Imperatoris. For some Custodians, their time as Eyes of the Emperor may well end up being the most defining part of their entire existence. Which, when you're part of the Golden 10,000, is saying a lot. The 10th edition Codex makes it clear that there are Eyes who serve not for decades, but for centuries and even millennia. And in a few cases, we get names. 3 to be precise. First up is Cheleda Zingria, who's described as a profound martial philosopher, which immediately makes me picture some terrifying blend of Sun Tzu, Bruce Lee, and a demigod with a halberd. It's such a vague, evocative title, but it screams mastery. The philosophy of violence, war as art, the custodian martial katars as living scripture. That kind of vibe. Then there's Xenobari Metmaxus, a former Blade champion. We don't get a lot of detail on him, but the title tells us a lot. Blade champions are rare, even among the Custodes. They wield Archaeotech Vault Swords. They're masters of every known form of melee combat, and embody the martial katars like no one else. These are the kinds of warriors who either cleave through entire armies solo, or go straight for the enemy's biggest, baddest warrior and take them down in single combat. So whatever Xenobari is doing as an eye now, I'm guessing it's a lot less spy stuff, and a lot more ripping and tearing until it is done. But the eye that really stood out to me, maybe the most fascinating of them all, is Protogathene Zul, or just Zul. To get why he's so interesting, you need to understand what a Custodian Lockwarden is. So here's a quick version. There's a shield host within the Custodes called the Shadowkeepers. Their job is guarding the Dark Cells, massive eldritch vaults beneath the Imperial Palace that contain horrors you can't begin to imagine. And when those horrors escape, it's the Shadowkeepers who are sent to get them back. Now, the Lockwarden is the Custodian who leads the Shadowkeepers, the one who gets called when something too dangerous for normal forces breaks loose. The current Lockwarden is a man named Borsa Thirsk, and he's held the role for nearly 2 centuries. But Zul was a Lockwarden long before Borsa, potentially thousands of years before him, and now he's an Eye of the Emperor. He's been one for so long that he's almost certainly outlived multiple generations of Lockwardens. Think about that for a moment. The kind of experience this guy must have, the stuff he's seen. He's been hunting and containing warp-spawned nightmares since before a lot of Imperial worlds even had names. The only other person who's probably encountered as many demonic or eldritch threats as him is likely none other than Kaldor Drago. What I love about all of this is how it shows just how diverse and far-reaching the Eyes of the Emperor can be. They're not just observers, they're not just shadow agents, they're philosophers, executioners, generals, and monster hunters. And for some of them, like Zul, like Metmaxus, like Zingria, it's not just a job, it's their true calling. There's one last bit of lore from the 10th edition Custodes Codex that blew me away, and it might just be one of the most interesting developments for the Eyes of the Emperor in the whole setting. It takes place in an area called the Cabraxis Reach, a remote and dangerous region of the galaxy. Things have gotten so bad for humanity out there that an unknown number of Eyes of the Emperor have banded together and formed what is essentially an unofficial shield host. A whole warband of Custodes, formerly operating as Eyes, now fighting as a cohesive unit, naming themselves the Eyes Unblinded. These aren't just golden warriors skulking in the shadows anymore. They're in full Auramite warplate, black robes, likely heavily augmented with cybernetics, and are throwing themselves headfirst into battle against full-blown heretic incursions. The Codex specifically says they're wearing golden armor, which is a really important detail. It confirms that the Eyes of the Emperor can retain their warplate, not just their weapons. That alone opens a ton of doors for what Eyes of the Emperor might look like in the field. But more than that, it's crazy to think that there's a force of post-human, heavily augmented ex-custodians out there who, visually, probably look a lot like the Iron Hands, but golden, with these great black robes. It's one of those little lore drops that hints at something way bigger. If Games Workshop ever decides to explore Cabraxis Reach further, or give us models for the Eyes Unblinded, I think I'd lose my mind. Because right now, somewhere, in the darkest reaches of the Imperium, there's a group of golden demigods absolutely tearing into the worst Chaos has to offer. Thank you all so much for watching, and remember to click the link in the description or to scan the QR code on the screen to download Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus now, for the Emperor. Behind every paragraph and reference in these videos, there's a mountain of research, editing, and more than a few burnt-out cogitators. That's where our patrons come in, with multiple tiers offering a variety of things, from exclusive chats in our Discord to personalized artwork created for our individual patrons. Every subscription keeps the machine spirit of the Astartes Anonymous YouTube channel appeased. And for our top-tier patrons, a display on the Wall of Honor at the end of each podcast. So if you're enjoying the content, please do consider taking a quick look at our Patreon. Thanks so much for watching.